Okay, you ready? When the white noise went off, we were in the garden pulling weeds. I always reacted badly to it. It didn't matter if it was outside, eating in the mess hall, or locked in my cabin. When it came, the shrieking tones blew up like a pipe bomb between my ears. Other girls at Thurman could pick themselves up after a few minutes, shaking off the nausea and disorientation like the loose grass clinging to their camp uniforms. But me? Hours would pass before I was able to piece myself back together. This time should have been no different, but it was. I didn't see what had happened to provoke the punishment. We were working so close to the camp's electric fence that I could smell the singed air and feel the voltage it shed vibrating in my teeth. Maybe someone got brave and decided to step out of the garden's bounds. Or maybe, dreaming big, someone fulfilled all our fantasies and threw a rock at the head of the nearest Special Forces soldier. That would have been worth it. The only thing I knew for certain was that the overhead speakers spurted with 2 warning blares, one short, one long. The skin on my neck crawled as I leaned forward into the damp dirt, my hands pressed tightly against my ears, shoulders tense to take the hit. The sound that came over the speakers wasn't really white noise. It wasn't that weird buzz in the air that the air sometimes takes on when you're sitting alone in silence, or the faint hum of a computer monitor. To the United States government and its Department of Psi Youth, it was the love child of a car alarm, a dental drill, turned up high enough to make your ears bleed. Literally. The sound ripped out of the speakers and shredded every nerve in my body. It forced its way past my hands, roaring over the screams of 100 teenage freaks, and settled at the center of my brain where I couldn't reach it and rip it out. My eyes flooded with tears. I tried to ram my face into the ground. All I could taste in my mouth was blood and dirt. A girl fell forward next to me, her mouth open in a cry I couldn't hear. Everything else faded out of focus. My body shook in time with a burst of static, curling in on itself like an old yellowing piece of paper. Someone's hands were shaking my shoulders. I heard someone say my name, Ruby, but I was too far gone to respond. Gone, 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 sinking until there was nothing, like the earth had swallowed me up in a single deep breath, then darkness and silence. Chapter 1. Grace Summerfield was the first to die. The first of my 4th grade class, at least. I'm sure that by then thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of kids had already up and gone the same way she had. People were slow to piece it together. Or at least they had figured out that the right way to keep us in the dark long after kids started dying. When the deaths finally came to light, my elementary school put a strict ban on teachers and staff talking to us about what was then called Everhart's disease, after Michael Everhart, the first kid known to have died of it. Soon, someone, somewhere, decided to give it a proper name, idiopathic adolescent acute neurodegeneration, IAN for short. And then it wasn't just Michael's disease, it was all of ours. All the adults knew I buried the knowledge beneath lying smiles and hugs. I was still stuck in my own world of sunshine, ponies, and my race car collection. Looking back, I couldn't believe how naive I was. Just how many clues I missed. Even big things like when my dad, a cop, started working longer hours and could barely stand to look at me when he finally did come home. My mom started me on a strict vitamin regimen and refused to let me be alone even for a few minutes. On the other hand, my parents were both only children. I didn't have any dead cousins to send up red flags, and my mom's refusal to let my dad install a soul-sucking vortex of trash and mindless entertainment, that thing commonly known as a television, meant that no scary news broadcast rocked my world. This, combined with the CIA-grade parental controls set up on our internet access, pretty much ensured I'd be far more concerned with how my stuffed animals were arranged on my bed than the possibility of dying before my 10th birthday. I was so completely unprepared for what happened on the 15th of September. It had rained the night before, so my parents sent me to school wearing red galoshes. In class, we talked about dinosaurs and practiced cursive before Mrs. Port dismissed us for lunch with her usual look of relief. I remember every detail of lunch that day clearly, not because I was sitting across from Grace at the table, but because I was the first, and because it wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't old like grandpops had been. She didn't have cancer like Mom's friend Sarah. No allergies, no cough, no head injury, nothing. When she died, it came completely out of the blue, and none of us understood what it meant until it was too late. Grace was locked in a deep debate about whether a fly was trapped inside her jello cup. The red mass shivered as she waved it around, inching over the edge of the container when she squeezed it a bit too tight. Naturally, everyone wanted to give their opinion on whether it was a fly or a piece of candy Grace had pushed in there, including me. I'm not a liar, Grace said. I just. She stopped. The plastic cup slipped from her fingers, hitting the table. Her mouth was open, eyes fixed on something just beyond my head. Grace's brow furrowed, almost as if she was listening to someone explain something very difficult. Grace, I remember saying, are you okay? Her eyes rolled back, flashing white in the second it took for her eyelids to droop down. Grace let out a small sigh, not even strong enough to blow away the strands of brown hair stuck to her lips. All of us sitting nearby froze, though we must have had the same exact thought. She's fainted. A week or two before, Josh Preston had passed out on the playground because, as Mrs. Port explained, we didn't have enough sugar in his system. Something stupid like that. The noon aide rushed over to the table. She was one of 4 old ladies with white visors and whistles who rotated lunch and playground duty during the week. I have no idea if she had any medical certifications beyond the vague notion of CPR, but she pulled Grace's sagging body to the ground all the same. She had a rapt audience as she pressed one ear to Grace's hot pink t-shirt, listening for a heartbeat that wasn't there. I don't know what the old lady thought, but she started yelling, and suddenly white visors and curious faces circled in on us. It wasn't until Ben Cho nudged Grace's limp hand with a sneaker that any of us realized she was dead. The other kids started screaming. One girl, Tess, was crying so hard she couldn't breathe. Small feet stampeded towards the cafeteria door. I just sat, surrounded by abandoned lunches, staring at the cup of jello and letting terror crawl through my mind until my arms and legs felt like they were frozen to the table forever. If the school security officer hadn't come and carried me outside, I don't know how long I would have stayed there. Grace is dead, I was thinking. Grace is dead? Grace is dead. And it got worse. A month later, after a big wave of deaths, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention released a 5-step list of symptoms to help parents identify whether their kid was at risk for EN. But by then, half my class was dead. My mom hid the list so well that I only found it by accident when I climbed on top of the kitchen counter to look for the chocolate she kept hidden behind her baking supplies. How to identify if your child is at risk, the flyer said. I recognized the flaming orange shade of the paper. It was the sheet Mrs. Port had sent home with her few remaining students days before. She had folded it twice and fastened it with 3 staples to prevent our reading. To the parents of Ruby only was written on the outside and underlined 3 times. 3 times was serious. My parents would have grounded me for opening it. Lucky for me, it was already open. Number 1, your child suddenly becomes sullen and withdrawn and loses interest in activities they previously enjoyed. Number 2, he or she begins to have an abnormal difficulty in concentrating or suddenly becomes hyper-focused on tasks, resulting in he or she losing track of time and or neglecting him or herself or others. Number 3, he or she experiences hallucinations, vomiting, chronic migraines, memory loss, and or fainting spells. Number 4, he or she becomes prone to violent outbursts, usually reckless behavior or self-injury, burns, bruising, and cuts that cannot be explained. Number 5, he or she develops behaviors or abilities that are inexplainable, dangerous, or cause you or others physical harm. If your child demonstrates any of the above symptoms, register him or her at en.gov and wait to be contacted about a local hospital to which he or she can be taken. When I finished reading the flyer, I folded it up neatly, put it exactly where I found it, and threw up in the sink. Graham's phone later that week, in her usual to-the-point Graham's way, explained everything to me. Kids were dying left and right, all about my age. But the doctors were working on it, and I wasn't supposed to be afraid because I was her granddaughter, and I would be fine. I should be good and tell my parents if I felt anything weird, understand? Things turned from bad to terrifying fast. A week after 3 or 4 kids in my neighborhood were burned, Burned, buried. Hello? They are working on an independent book study, so some of them were able to pick anything that they had at home. Okay. Is it like a dog or is it a? Hmm. One of them is looking at me with a face right now. You want to explain what that face is? I was gonna give it a okay. Oh, doctor. It was like a guilty look, like you might know. Yeah. I would. A week after 3 of the 4 kids in my neighborhood were buried, the president made a formal address to the nation. Mom and Dad watched the live stream on their computer, and I listened from outside the office door. My fellow Americans, President Gray began, today we face a devastating crisis, one that threatens not only our children's lives, but the very future of our great nation. May it comfort you to know that in our time of need, we in Washington are developing programs both to support the families affected by this horrid affliction and the children blessed enough to survive it. I wish I could have seen his face as he spoke, because I think he knew, he must have, that this threat, the crimp in our supposedly glorious future, had nothing to do with the kids who had died, buried underground or burned to ash. They couldn't do anything but haunt the memories of the people who had loved them. They were gone, forever. And that symptoms list, the one they had sent home folded and stapled by teachers, which was aired 100 times over the news, as the faces of the dead scrolled along the bottom of the screen, the government was never scared about the kids who might die or the empty spaces that they would leave behind. They were afraid of us, the ones who lived. Chapter 2. It rained the day they brought us to Thurmond, and it went on to rain straight through the week, and the week after that, freezing rain, the kind that would have been snow if it had been 5 degrees colder. I remember watching the drops trace frantic paths down the length of the school bus window. If I had been back at home, inside one of my parents' cars, I would have followed the drops' swerving routes across the old, cold grass with my fingertips. Now my hands were tied together behind my back, and the men in the black uniforms had packed 4 of us into a seat. There was barely room to breathe. The heat from 100-odd bodies fogged the windows, and it acted like a screen to the outside world. Later, the windows of the bright yellow buses they used to bring kids in would be smeared with black paint. They just hadn't thought of it yet. I was closest to the window on the 5-hour drive, so I could make out slivers of the passing landscape whenever the rain let up for a bit. It all looked exactly the same to me: green farms, thick expanses of trees. We could have still been in Virginia, for all I knew. The girl sitting next to me, the one that would later be classified blue, seemed to recognize a sign at one point because she leaned over me to get a better look. She looked a little familiar to me, like I had seen her face from around my town, or she was from the next one over. I think all of the kids with me were from Virginia, but there was no way to be sure because there was only one big rule, and that was silence. After they had picked me up from my house the day before, they'd kept me, along with the rest of the kids, in some kind of warehouse overnight. The room was washed with unnatural brightness as they set us in the cluster of the dirty cement floor, and they pointed 3 floodlights towards us. We weren't allowed to sleep. My eyes were watering so badly from the dust that I couldn't see the clammy, pale faces around me, let alone the faces of the soldiers who stood just beyond the ring of lights, watching. In some weird way, they ceased to be whole men and women. In the gray haze of half sleep, I processed them in small, terrifying pieces: the gasoline reek of shoe polish, the creak of the stiff leather, the twist of disgust on their lips, the tip of a boot as it dug into my side, forcing me back awake. The next morning, the drive was completely silent except for the soldiers' radios and the kids that were crying towards the back of the bus. The kid sitting at the other end of our seat wet his pants, and he wasn't about to tell that to the red-haired PSF standing beside him. She had slapped him when he complained that he hadn't eaten anything all day. I flexed my bare feet against the ground, trying to keep my legs still. Hunger was making my head feel funny, too, bubbling up every once in a while to overwhelm, even the spikes of terror shooting through me. It was hard to focus, harder to sit still. I felt like I was shrinking, trying to fade back into the seat and disappear completely. My hands were starting to lose feeling, and after being in the same position for so long, trying to stretch the plastic band they tightened around them, did nothing but force it to cut deeper into the soft skin there. Psi Special Forces, that was what the driver of the bus had called himself, and the others when they collected us from the warehouse. You were to come with us on the authority of the Psi Special Forces commander, Joseph Taylor. He held up a paper to prove it, so I guess it was true. I had been taught not to argue with adults anyway. The bus took a deep dip as I pulled off the narrow road and into the smaller dirt one. The new vibration woke whoever had been lucky or exhausted enough to fall asleep. They also sent the black uniforms into action. The men and women stood straighter, and their attention snapped towards the windshield. I saw the towering fence first. The darkening gray sky cast everything into a moldy, deep blue, but not the fence, a moody, deep blue. It was glowing silver as the wind whistled through its open pockets. Just below my window were dozens of men and women in full uniform, escorting the bus at a brisk jog. The PSFs in the control booth at the gate stood and saluted the driver as he navigated past them. The bus lurched to a stop, and we were all forced to stay deathly still as the camp gate slid shut behind us. The locks cracked through the silence like thunder, and they came together again. We were not the first bus through. That had come a year before. We were not the last bus either. That would come in 3 more years when the camp's occupancy had maxed out. There was a single breath of stillness before the soldier in a black rain poncho rapped on the bus door. The driver reached over and pulled the lever, and ended everyone's hope that this was a short pit stop. The PSF was an enormous man, the kind you'd expect to play an evil giant in a movie, or a villain in a cartoon. He kept his hood up, masking his face, hair, and anything that would have let me recognize him later. I guess it didn't matter. He wasn't speaking for himself. He was speaking for the camp. "You will stand and exit the bus in an orderly fashion," he yelled. The driver tried to hand him a microphone, but the soldier knocked it away with his hand. "You will be divided into groups of 10, and you will be brought in for testing. Do not try to run. Do not speak. Do not do anything other than what is asked of you. Failure to follow these instructions will be met with punishment." At 10, I was one of the younger kids on the bus, though there were certainly a few kids younger. Most seemed to be 12, even 13. The hate and mistrust burning in the soldiers' eyes must have shrunken my spine, but it only sparked rebellion in the older kids. "Go screw yourself," someone yelled from the back of the bus. We all turned at once, just in time to see the PSF with flaming red hair launched the butt of her rifle into the teenage boy's mouth. He let out a shriek of pain and surprise, as the soldier did it again, and I saw a faint spray of blood burst from his mouth when he took the next angry breath. With his hands behind his back, there was no way he could block the attack. He just had to take it. They began moving kids off the bus, one seat of 4 at a time. But I was still watching that kid, the way he seemed to cloud the air around him with silent, toxic fury. I don't know if he felt me staring or what, but the boy turned around and met my gaze. He nodded at me like an encouragement, and then he smiled. And when he smiled, it was around a mouthful of bloody teeth. I felt myself being hauled up out of my seat, and almost before I realized what was happening, I was slipping down the wet bus steps and tumbling into the pouring rain. A different PSF lifted me off my knees and guided me in the direction of 2 other girls about my age. Their clothes clung to them like an old skin, translucent and drooping. There were nearly 20 PSFs on the ground, swarming the neat, small lines of kids. My feet had been completely swallowed by the mud, and I was shivering in my pajamas, but no one took notice, and no one came up to cut the plastic binding our hands. We waited, silently, tongues clamped between our teeth. I looked up to the clouds, turning my face into the pounding rain. It looked like the sky was falling piece by piece. The last groups of 4 were being lifted off the bus and dropped into the ground, including the boy with the broken face. He was the last one off, just behind the tall, blonde girl with a blank stare. I could barely make them out through the sheet of rain in the foggy bus windows, but I was sure I saw the boy lean forward and whisper something into the girl's ear, just as she took the first steps off the bus. She nodded, a quick jerk of her chin. The second her shoes touched the mud, she bolted to the right, ducking around the nearest PSF's hands. One of the PSFs barked out a terrifying stop, but she kept running straight for the gates. With everyone's attention turned towards her, no one thought to look back at the boy still on the bus. No one but me. He came slinking down the steps, the front of his white hooded sweatshirt stained with his own blood. The same PSF who had hit him before was now helping him down to the ground, as she had done with the rest of us. I watched her fingers close around his elbow and felt the echo of her grip on my own newly bruised skin. I watched him turn and say something to her, his face a mask of perfect calm. I watched the PSF let go of his arm, take her gun out of the holster, and without a word, without even blinking, stick the barrel inside of her mouth and pull the trigger. I don't know if I screamed aloud or if the strangled sound had come from the woman waking up to what she was doing, 2 seconds too late to stop. The image of her face, her slack jaw, her eyes bulging out of her skull, the ripple of suddenly loose skin, stayed burned into the air like a photo negative far longer than the explosion of pink, misty blood and clumps of hair around the bus. The kid standing next to me dropped into a dead faint, and there wasn't a single one of us who wasn't screaming. The PSF hit the ground at the exact same moment the girl was tackled into the mud. The rain washed the soldier's blood down off the bus windows and yellow panels, stretching the bloated dark lines, drawing them out as they disappeared completely. It was that fast. The boy was looking only at us. "Run!" he yelled through his broken teeth. "What are you doing? Run! Run!" The first thing that went through my mind was, "What are you?" Was it not, "What are you?" or even "Why?" It was, "But I have nowhere else to go." He might as well have blown the entire bus up for the panic it caused. Some kids listened and tried to bolt for the fence, only to have their path blocked by a line of soldiers in black that seemed to pour out of the air. Most stood there and screamed and screamed and screamed, the rain falling all around, the mud sucking their feet down firmly in place. A girl knocked me down and ran to the ground with her shoulder as the other PSFs rushed for the boy, still standing at the bus doorway. The soldiers were yelling at us to sit down on the ground, to stay frozen where I was there, and I did exactly as I was told. "Orange," I heard one of them yell into the walkie-talkie. "We have a situation at the main gate. Need restraints for an orange." It wasn't until after they had rounded us back up and had the boy with the broken face on the ground that I dared to look up, and that I began to wonder, dread trickling down my spine, if he was the only one who could do something like that, or if everyone around me was there because they could cause someone to hurt themselves that way too. "Not me," the words buzzed through my head. "Not me. They made a mistake. A mistake." I watched with a feeling of hollowness at the center of my chest as one of the soldiers took a can of spray paint in hand and painted an enormous orange X over the boy's back. The boy had only stopped yelling because two PSS had pulled a strange black mask down over the lower part of his face, like they were muzzling a dog. Tension beaded on my skin like sweat. They marched our lines through the camp towards the infirmary for sorting. As we walked, we saw kids heading in the opposite direction, from a row of pathetic wood cabins. All of them were wearing a white uniform, with a different colored X marked on each of their backs, and a number written in black above it. I saw 5 different colors in all: green, blue, yellow, orange, and red. The kids with the green and blue X's were allowed to walk freely, their hands swinging at their sides. Those with a faint yellow X, or an orange or red one, were forced to fight through the mud with their hands and feet in metal cuffs, a long chain connecting them in a line. The ones marked with an orange smears had muzzle-like masks over their faces. We were hurried into the bright lights and dry air of what a torn paper sign had labeled infirmary. The doctors and nurses lined the long hallway, watching us with frowns and shaking, and it took all of my concentration not to slip. My nose was filled with the smell of rubbing alcohol and fake lemon. We filed one by one up a dark cement staircase at the back of the first floor, which was filled with empty beds and limp white curtains. Not an orange, not a red. I could feel my guts churning from the pit of my stomach. I couldn't stop seeing the woman's face right when she pulled the trigger, or the mass of her bloody hair that had landed near my feet. I couldn't stop seeing my mom's face when she had locked me out of the garage. I couldn't stop seeing Graham's face. She'll come, I thought. She'll come. She'll fix Mom and Dad, and she'll come get me. She'll come, she'll come, she'll come. Upstairs, they finally cut the plastic binding that tied our hands and divided us again, sending half down the right end of a freezing hallway and half to the left. Both sides looked exactly the same. No more than a few closed doors and a small window at the very end. For a moment, I did nothing but watch the rain pelt the tiny, foggy pane of glass. And then the door on the left swung open with a low whine, and the face of a plump, middle-aged man appeared. He cast one look in our direction before whispering something to the PSF at the head of the group. One by one, more doors opened and more adults appeared. The only thing they had in common, aside from their white coats, was a shared look of suspicion. Without a single word of explanation, the PSF began pulling and pushing kids towards each white coat and its associated office. The outburst of confused, distressed noises that erupted from the lines was shushed with a piercing buzzer. I fell back onto my heels, watching the doors shut one by one, wondering if I would ever see those kids again. What's wrong with us? My head felt like it was full of wet sand as I looked over my shoulder. The boy with the broken face was nowhere, but his memory had chased me all the way through camp. Did they bring us here because they thought we had Everhart's disease? Did they think we were going to die? How had the boy made the PSF do what she'd done? What had he said to her? I felt a hand slide into mine as I stood there, trembling hard enough for my joints to hurt. The girl, the same one that had pulled me down in the mud outside, gave me a fierce look. Her dark blonde hair was plastered against her skull, framing a pink scar that curved between her top lip and her nose. The dark eyes flashed when she spoke. I saw that they had cut wires on her braces and left the metal nubs glued to her front teeth. "Don't be scared," she whispered. "Don't let them see." A handwritten label on the tag of her jacket said Samantha Doll, and it stuck out against the back of her neck like an afterthought. We stood shoulder to shoulder, close enough that our linked fingers were hidden between the fabric of my pajama pants and her purple puffer jacket. They had picked her up on their way to school in the same morning they had come for me. It had been a day ago, but I remembered seeing her dark eyes burning bright with hate at the black van they had locked us in. She hadn't screamed as the others had. The kids who had disappeared through the doors now came back through them, clutching gray sweaters and shorts in their hands. Instead of falling back into our line, they were marched downstairs before anyone could get a word or questioning look in. They don't look hurt. I could smell permanent marker and something that might have been rubbing alcohol, but no one was bleeding or crying. It was finally the girl's turn, and the PSF at the head of the line forced us apart with a sharp jerk. I wanted to go in with her, to face whatever was behind the door. Anything had to be better than being alone, without anyone or anything to anchor myself to. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to cross my arms and grip my elbows to get them to stop. I stood at the front of the line, looking at the gleaming span of checkered tile between the PSS black boots and my mud-splattered shoes. I was already tied down to my bones from the sleepless night before, and the scent of the soldier's boot polish sent my head deeper into a fog. And then they called for me. I found myself in a dimly lit office, half the size of my cramped bedroom at home, with no memory of ever having walked into it. Name. I was looking at a cot and a strange halo-shaped gray machine hanging over it. The white coat's the white coat's face appeared from behind the laptop on the table. He was a frail-looking man, whose silver glasses seemed to be in serious danger of sliding off his nose with every quick movement. His voice was unnaturally high, and he didn't so much as say the word as squeak it. I pressed my back against the closed door, trying to put space between me, the man, and the machine. The white coat followed my gaze to the cot. It's a scanner. There's nothing to be afraid of. I must not have looked convinced because he continued, Have you ever broken a bone or bumped your head? Do you know what a CT scan is? It was the patience in his voice that drew me a step forward. I shook my head. In a minute, I'm going to have you lie down. I'll use that machine to check to make sure your head is all right, but first you need to tell me your name. Make sure your head is all right. How did he know? Your name, he said, the words taking a sudden edge. Ruby, I answered, and I had to spell my last name for him. He began typing on the laptop, distracted for a moment. My eyes drifted back over the machine, wondering how painful it would be for me to have the inside of my head inspected, wondering if he could somehow see what I had done. Damn, they're getting lazy, the white coat groused, more to himself than me. Didn't they pre-classify you? I had no idea what he was talking about. When they picked you up, didn't they ask you questions? He asked, standing. The room wasn't large by any means. He was at my side in 2 steps, and I was in full panic and 2 heartbeats. Did your parents report your symptoms to the soldiers? Symptoms? I squeezed out. I don't have any symptoms. I don't have the... He shook his head, looking more annoyed than anything else. Calm down. You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you. The white coat kept talking, his voice flat, something flickering in his eyes. The lies sounded practiced. There are many different kinds of symptoms, he explained, leaning down to look me eye to eye. All I could see were his crooked front teeth and the dark circles rimming his eyes. His breath smelled like coffee and spearmint. Many different kinds of children. I'm going to take a picture of your brain, and it'll help us put you with the others who are like you. I shook my head. I don't have any symptoms. Gramps is coming. She is. I swear she'll tell you, please. Tell me, sweetheart, are you very good at math and puzzles? Greens are incredibly smart and have astonishing memories. My mind jumped back to the kids outside, to the colored X's on the backs of their shirts. Green, I thought. What have been the other colors been? Red, blue, yellow, and orange, like the boy with the bloody mouth. All right, he said, taking a deep breath. Just lie back on the cot and we'll get started. Now, please. I didn't move. Thoughts were rushing too quickly to my head. It was a struggle to even look at him. Now, he repeated, moving towards the machine. Don't make me call on one of the soldiers. They won't be nearly as nice, believe me. The screen on the side panel came alive with a single touch, and the machine itself lit up. At the center of the gray circle was a bright white light, blinking as it set itself up for another test. It was breathing out hot air and sputters and whines that seemed to pick up every pore in my body. All I could think was, he'll know. He'll know what I did to them. My back was flat against the door again, my hand blindly searching for the handle. Every single lecture my dad had ever given me about strangers seemed to be coming true. This was not a safe place. This man was not nice. I was shaking so hard he might have thought I was going to faint. That, or he was going to force me onto the cot himself and hold me there until the machine came down and locked over me. I hadn't been ready to run before, but I was now. As my fingers tightened on the door handle, I felt his hand push through my unruly mass of dark hair and seize the back of my neck. The shock of his freezing hand on my flushed skin made me flinch, but it was the explosion of pain at the base of my skull that made me cry out. He stared at me, unblinking, his eyes suddenly unfocused. But I was seeing everything, impossible things. Hands drumming on a car steering wheel, a woman in a black dress leaning forward to kiss me, a baseball flying towards my face out of a diamond, an endless stretch of green field, a hand running through a little girl's hair. The images played out behind my closed eyes like an old home movie. Shapes of people and objects burned themselves into my retinas and stayed there, floating around behind my eyelids like hungry ghosts. Not mine, my mind screamed. These don't belong to me. But how could they have been his? Each image, they were memories, thoughts. When I saw more, a boy, the same scanner machine above him, flickering and smoking, yellow. I felt my lips form the words as if I had been the one to say them. I saw a small red-haired girl from across the room, much like this one. I saw her lift a finger, and the table and laptop in front of her rise several inches from the ground. Blue. Again the man's voice in my head. A boy holding a pencil between his hands, studying it with terrifying intensity, the pencil bursting into flames. Red. Cards with pictures and numbers on them held up in front of a child's face. Green. I squeezed my eyes shut and I couldn't pull back from the images as they came next. Lines of marching, muzzled monsters. I was standing high above, looking through the rain-spattered glass as I saw the handcuffs and the chains. I saw everything. I'm not one of them. Please, please, please. I fell to my knees, bracing my hands against the tile, trying to keep from being sick all over myself on the floor. The white coat's hand still gripped the back of my neck. I'm green, I sobbed, the words half lost in the machine's buzzing. The light had been bright before, and now only amplified the pounding behind my eyes. I stared into his blank eyes, willing him to believe me. I'm green. Please, please. But I saw my mother's face, the smile the boy with broken mouth had given me, and I recognized something of himself in me. I knew what I was. Green. I looked up at the sound of his voice and floated down as it floated down to me. I stared, and he stared right back, his eyes unfocused. He was mumbling something now, his mouth full of mush like he was chewing on the words. I'm green, he said, shaking his head. His voice sounded stronger. I was still on the floor when he went and shut down the machine, and I was so shocked when he sat back down on the desk that I actually forgot to cry. But it wasn't until he picked up a green spray paint and drew an enormous X over the back of the uniform shirt and handed it to me that I remembered to start breathing. It'll be okay, I told myself as I walked back down the cold hallway, down the steps to the girls and the men in the uniforms waiting for me below. It wasn't until that night, as I lay awake in my bunk, that I realized that I had only ever had one chance to run, and I hadn't taken it.